Thank you for coming. I hope there are a variety of people here. I know that some of my students are here, which is very nice. Now I'm just going to try and start by sharing my screen here so you can see my PowerPoint. And then when I've done that, I will begin. So the name of my lecture is Dishonesty and Prediction in Henry IV, Part 1. Now, I hope you are a little bit familiar with the play because I'm going to get deep into the weeds eventually. Here is my opening statement. This is my opening statement. Shakespeare's Henry IV is a liar and a hypocrite. Now, why should that be a controversial statement? After all, the very first step of Henry Bolingbroke towards political power after his exile to France is the following. He kidnaps two of King Richard II's closest friends and advisors, Bushy and Green, and publicly executes them on the most flimsy and offensive pretext that they had sex with Richard's queen. You have in manner with your sinful hours made a divorce betwixt his queen and him, broke the possession of a royal bed, and stained the beauty of a fair queen's cheeks. Now this is a queen who is presented with no ambiguity as spotless and devoted to her husband, even asking to go with him to prison in the Tower of London. It doesn't matter whether Bushy and Green are useful advisors or not. What matters is Bolingbroke's willingness to use the most foul and the most convenient kind of lie. So, shortly thereafter, King Richard will be murdered, and Bolingbroke, who by now has been crowned King Henry IV, cannot even pretend to be innocent of Richard's murder. Instead, he simply exiles the loyal servants who actually did the deed and stabbed Richard to death. He exiles them with the blithe hypocrisy of the following. They do not love poison that do poison need. This is the person who becomes King Henry IV. Now, even at the end of his life, King Henry admits to his own son the following. God knows, my son, by what bypass and indirect crooked ways I met this crown, and all my friends, which thou must make thy friends, have but their stings and teeth newly ta'en out, by whose fell working I was first advanced. So he more or less freely admits that he and his friends have engaged in what Hugh Grady calls the royal robbery of the Lancasters. And Shakespeare knew perfectly well the figurative sense of the word crooked, as in the Geneva Bible from 1560. Deuteronomy says this, they have corrupted themselves towards him by their vice, not being his children, but a froward and crooked generation. So, King Henry is a liar and a hypocrite. Why should that be a controversial statement? Well, there are two reasons it would be considered a controversial statement, neither of them good. The first is the possibility of anachronism. The second is what I call the Neo-Tillyardian literary heritage of Shakespeare critics. So first, are we making an anachronistic judgment by imposing contemporary moral views on Shakespeare and the imperial state in which he lived, or the monarchical feudal system of Henry IV's time? For there is no avoiding the fact that I am not merely stating that Henry is a liar, but that I am criticizing him for it. That is to say, I believe that Shakespeare is at the very least enabling my critique. Well, let's be clear. Some degree of anachronism in interpretation is inevitable, even though it can and has led to critical abuse. For example, a statement like Shakespeare is Marxist or anti-Marxist is clearly anachronistic and should be avoided.
very dangerous. Shakespeare's feminist or anti-feminist. I still say that is an example of anachronism and should be avoided. Shakespeare is a humanist. Now, that is certainly not necessarily anachronistic and needs serious consideration. But I have seen dozens of anachronistic statements about Shakespeare as a humanist, both from students and from academics themselves, based on a misperception of the historical meaning of the term humanism, since even our concept of Renaissance humanism comes really not directly from Renaissance texts. It comes from the 20th century admirable historian Hans Baron. And yet there must be some degree of anachronism in interpretation. That is, there must be some degree of investing the interpretation of an old text with both the meanings and the values, implicit, explicit, or assumed, in the modern language that we use. What I mean to say is this: it is not strictly speaking accurate as a matter of method to say that the meaning of a literary text does, in any real sense, begins with the historical context of production. In fact, the meaning of a literary text begins and ends, more or less, with the reader. And we are all contemporary or future readers. And not only does the meaning of a literary text begin with the reader, who literally has to make sense out of the text as best as he can, but in particular, the author of the text is also constructed by the reader. Shakespeare, as a Renaissance gentleman poet, is long gone, and all his thoughts are gone too. All we have are texts solidly attributed to the person named Shakespeare. In other words, Shakespeare is no more or less than a composite textual intentionality which can be assumed based on plenty of evidence at work in the arrangement of the text. The reader, again, the reader makes meaning out of the text, and the only thing that limits the reader's interpretative autonomy is that the language he thinks in is not his own. It is inherited. It has a history. Now, all of this leads to the conclusion that there is no one Shakespeare. There is only multiple Shakespeares, each belonging in a sense to different cultures and periods, and indeed, to some extent, to different readers. Thus, it is perfectly legitimate for there to be a romantic Shakespeare, a modernist Shakespeare, a postmodernist Shakespeare, and that is a perfectly good thing. That is to say, there are no readings of Shakespeare, only misreadings, and that's okay too. Gadamer famously claimed that it was cultural tradition, the history of ideas, including presumably the philological tradition, that determined the meanings that new readers found in old texts. But Gadamer gave, I think, too much credence or faith in a unified and publicly accessible cultural tradition, when most people, including international readers, have a partial or limited grasp of the cultural understandings that would be particularly relevant to a Shakespeare play. Every teacher knows this. In other words, each new reader has a unique and exclusive blend and proportion of linguistic knowledge, linguistic acumen, interpretative creativity, and inherited cultural knowledge, for example, about Shakespeare the man. And yet it is utterly absurd, as Gadamer would agree, to say that because of those limitations, that a 16th century reader would be an ideal reader of Shakespeare, or to dismiss what the modern reader brings to the textual experience. In Gadamer's view, I think, we can accept without disappointment that our present-day readings are in a sense limited and parochial, so long as we recognize that the validity of those readings is historically contingent. Now, let me just give a very simple example of the benefit that a modern audience has over a theoretical Renaissance audience from Act 3 of King Henry IV, Part 1. Now, this is a very simple example. I could give a much more complex example, and perhaps I can if you're interested at the end of this lecture. So here is a simple example. The courageous rebel Hotspur, who rebels against the king. The courageous rebel Hotspur meets the Welsh warrior prince Owen Glendower, who considers himself to be a wizard, a magician, much like the characters of Harry Potter. And Glendower says, "I can call spirits from the vasty deep." And Hotspur responds, "Why, so can I, and so can any man. But will they come when you do call for them?" And then Glendower says, "I can teach you, cousin, to tame the devil." And Hotspur says, I can teach thee, cuz, to shame the devil by telling truth." So the point I'm making here is that, to put it simply, theater audiences of the 21st century will be far more skeptical of Glendower's magical claims than Elizabethan theater audiences, and even, I think, most Elizabethan readers. And thus, modern audiences are more supportive of Hotspur and his skepticism, and in so doing may be actually closer to Shakespeare's point of view than most of Shakespeare's contemporaries. And also Hotspur's honesty, as we shall see, makes his downfall at the end of the play all the more tragic. So modern reading has its advantages. Okay, so here's the problem. If the modern reader has so much more power than even, I think, Gadamer recognized, then what limits the modern reader from interpreting any meaning he wants out of a Shakespeare text? In other words, how do we distinguish good, bad, and simply wrong interpretations of Shakespeare? Well, the answer is the text itself, the fixity of the text. The text as a matter of language, once accurately construed by qualified scholars of textual criticism, the text as a matter of language is the limitation on possible meanings and possible readings. Now, part of my argument here is that we can stretch out the connotations of a word. We can bring modern connotations of a word into Shakespeare. Most people will, and in fact, there's just no way to entirely avoid modernizing Shakespeare's diction to some extent, and no reason to. But to erase a word from the text, to pretend it's not there, to substitute another word in place of the word in the text, may be called an interpretative fallacy, and often a dishonest critical malpractice. Or it could be considered a deliberate and self-conscious act of rewriting by new authors, as was often seen in the pastiche political theater of the late 1960s. So no one can stop you from doing these things, but if you do, you are no longer interpreting Shakespeare's text. You are writing a new text that corresponds to your own desires. So the reader, and particularly the scholar, must strive to creatively read without rewriting. The scholar especially has this duty, I would say. We have to have some ethics in our profession again, I think. Also, there are, I believe, wrong interpretations of text as a matter of logic. And there are also bad interpretations, just by virtue of ignoring some part of the text in order to create an unduly selective interpretation of the whole text. Here is an amusing anecdote about unwanted anachronisms. And it's from a fellow named Machiavelli, and it's about teaching Beowulf to his class. And this is what Machiavelli said. Every student in the room was working with a mental picture of Hrothgar's Hall, the castle. Of Hrothgar's Hall. Every student in the room was working with a mental picture obviously constructed on the basis of what we all know about the Middle Ages. This popular culture picture I discovered derived from Arthurian films, Conan the Barbarian, Dungeons and Dragons, and from some other sources, and it was so powerful that it caused them to ignore the actual words of the text at several points, and to build an imaginative picture of the world of the poem in spite of the details that the poem provides rather than on top of those details. So let me be clear. The reader's modern imagination, the reader's historical imagination is great. It's wonderful, but it should be on top of the text, not in spite of the text. As my old Latin professor, the great scholar Kenneth Kitchell, used to say whatever you want as long as you have a text to back it up. Now, it took me years to realize what he was saying. What he was really saying was, say what you want about the text as long as you are not contradicting the language of the text. Wittgenstein said, does it matter what we say so long as we avoid misunderstandings in any particular case? A very provocative question. So, the point I'm making is this: we can and do make meanings out of texts that could not have been made at the time that the text was composed. But we cannot make certain statements about the text, particularly statements about the intentionality of the text and its composers, because those statements are false by virtue of anachronism or by virtue of falsifying the text, which often amounts to the same thing, or the statements are simply critically irresponsible and just plain bad. So here's the final question about this. Is there an appreciable difference between my saying that King Henry IV is a bad king, and is there a difference between that and a strident modern reader boldly asserting that King Henry V, who invades France, is a fascist? And I believe I can convince you of a Shakespeare based on the text of his plays who views Henry IV as an unnecessarily dishonest and therefore bad king. I don't believe I have the same license by the text to make a claim such as Shakespeare presents Henry V as a fascist, or Shakespeare presents Caliban as an anti-colonial freedom fighter, which is a claim that has sometimes been seen and made. Because the words of the text, as Gadamer recognized, have themselves a historicity to them, and those words do not authorize us to think of Shakespeare, even as the object of our text-based but contemporary construction. Those words do not authorize us to think of Shakespeare as having access to the historical and philosophical discourses of colonialism or fascism that we now have. All right, now let's move on from the troubling but interesting issue of anachronism to the next problem. Henry IV is a liar and a hypocrite. Why should that be controversial? Well, one reason is what I call academic path-dependency, the influence of the Neo-Tillyardians on Shakespearean scholarship, which has been huge until perhaps the last decade, or last 15 years. Now, the Academy has had an 80-year dependence on a not particularly brilliant patriotic English critic named E.M.W. Tillyard, who wrote in 1943 that Shakespeare advocated, along with all other Elizabethans of his class, that Shakespeare advocated a belief in a divinely ordained social order as reflective of a divinely ordered cosmos, such that the anointed king, of course, ruled by absolute divine right. Now, let me make clear from the start that I think that the exact opposite of this is true, in that in Shakespeare's history plays, the right of kingship, the right to be a king, is constantly negotiable and constantly being contested by law, by right, by opinion, and especially by lineage. and therefore cannot be by divine right, or else the former things would not even enter into it. But I won't try to prove this claim. Instead, let me just show how easily Tillyard's view of Shakespeare comes into question at the moment when the legitimate King Richard, who is the absolutely legitimate ruler by law, by right, by any interpretation, the moment he is deposed in a military coup by Henry Bolingbroke, which Shakespeare does not represent as having even the slightest claim to legitimacy. And since Henry Bolingbroke is going to be the father, in fact, since he is the father of the so-called greatest of all English kings, the mirror of all English kings, I quote, Henry V, since Henry Bolingbroke is the father of the great English king Henry V, then that same belief in the divinely ordained king becomes a mass of inevitable contradictions, such that the attempts of Tudor historians such as Edward Hall to make sense of the providential view of English kingship just became mired in confusion. So let's pay attention to the moment that Richard II loses his crown to Henry IV. So this is what Jan Kott, the great Polish scholar, had to say. Let us begin with the great abdication scene in Richard II, the scene omitted in all editions published in Queen Elizabeth's lifetime. It revealed the workings of the grand mechanisms of power too brutally. The very moment when power was changing hands is revealed. Authority, by which he means royal authority comes either from God or from the people. But there is a flash of the sword, the applause of intimidated noblemen, a shout from the forcibly gathered crowds. And behold, the new authority too comes from God or from the will of the people. The former king still lives, but is deprived of his crown. If the former king is not a traitor, and if the former king is king by divine right, I would add, then the new king is a usurper. And yet, Henry will be anointed by the church and by everyone else as England's king by divine authority, just as Richard was before. So what does Tillyard actually have to say about Henry and these contradictions in metaphysical kingship that Shakespeare introduced so controversially into his writings that his play had to be censored? In truth, and this is fascinating, in truth, Tillyard, in his book, Shakespeare's History Plays, actually says almost nothing about King Henry IV and his actual behavior. And I just want to stop here for a moment and make the fascinating observation that all the major essays of the 20th century, all of the major essays of the 20th century on the Henry plays, such as Tillyard, Greenblatt, and a couple others which are really influential, not one of them discusses in detail the behavior of the king in part one. So what does Tillyard actually say about King Henry IV? Well, this is what Tillyard says, and it's a statement that chokes me up with laughter because it is so bad. Tillyard says, Henry is a good ruler and is humble before God. Well, of course, everybody in a Christian culture is humble before God if they've committed a terrible crime and they want to escape judgment. Or to paraphrase the great A.D. Nuttall, Christ loved the world. Henry just loves Henry. Now, King Claudius of Denmark is a bit wiser than Henry IV or Tillyard. Claudius knows that as humble and contrite as you may feel, you are not likely to be forgiven by God for the crime of royal murder and usurpation while you are still actively enjoying the spoils of your crime and plotting to kill and destroy anyone else who claims the right to take it away from you. This is what King Claudius says. But oh, what form of prayer can serve my turn? Forgive me my foul murder. That cannot be, since I am still possessed of those effects for which I did the murder, my crown, mine own ambition, and my queen. May one be pardoned and retain the offense. In the corrupted currents of this world, oft is seen the wicked prize itself buys out the law, but 'tis not so above. There is no shuffling. There the action lies in his true nature. So Claudius knows better. Now, modern critics are not as obtuse as Tillyard, but because of Tillyard, they are unwilling to say that Shakespeare disapproves of King Henry's lies. And so, in the same manner that we have had 100 years of literary critics who feel a self-righteous moral duty to register their finger-wagging disapproval at Sir John Falstaff, despite the fact that Falstaff delighted British audiences as the unquestioned main character of the play for over 300 years. In the same way that critics felt they had to disapprove of Falstaff, we have had 100 years of the absurd spectacle of critics, whether they be patriots, nihilists, relativists, Machiavellis, even probably Nietzscheans. We have had them making excuses for and pussyfooting around the obvious lies and hypocrisies of King Henry IV. Now, it's long been known that Tillyard made a lot of mistakes. And I'm not going to go through them now for fear of boredom. I don't want to go on too long. You can read them at your leisure. I'd make the PowerPoint available. But I will point out one mistake because it's important to me, which is that this is number 4 on the slide. I think his worst mistake, and it's a mistake that is very common in theatrical stagings of the play. His worst sin was that he treated Henry IV Part 1 as a sort of preamble to Henry IV Part 2, as if it was an incomplete fragment that was only waiting for the second part for its completion. Now, this is, of course, ridiculous, and the opposite is true. Only the first part stands on its own as a drama in itself that is independent of all the other history plays that Shakespeare wrote. There is no evidence whatsoever that Shakespeare wrote Henry IV around 1598. There is no evidence that he wrote it with the intention of writing a sequel to it later on. Only the first play stands on its own, whereas the second play depends, naturally enough, on constant reference to Part 1 and the previous history plays. Now, Tillyard has had a bad influence on academia. As it's been pointed out many times, the new historicists and the so-called British cultural materialists of the 1980s dealt with the patriotic Tillyard, who ought to have been their natural enemy. They dealt with him by backhandedly agreeing with him. Whereas Tillyard praised Shakespeare as a sort of transcendental ideological royalist, the post-Foucauldian critics simply agreed with him, and they blamed Shakespeare for being or posing as a transcendental ideological royalist. That is, a transcendental royalist absolutist ideologue. So they basically accepted the same interpretation and blamed him for it. As one obscure critic, Tennenhouse, who is the kind of critic who might get tenure by saying something outrageous about a literary giant, Tennenhouse says, Shakespeare's plays act as a vehicle for disseminating court ideology by idealizing political authority, and that Shakespeare understands power as the inevitable unfolding of order. Well, this is what I say to that. If Shakespeare's portrait of Henry IV is designed to idealize royal authority, he did an awful job, just awful. Now it's time to get into the play and to the text, to get deep into the text. Right. Well, I just want to say, to finish up with Tillyard, none of these literary critical politics has really much to do with what Shakespeare actually wrote in Henry IV, Part 1, about a deceitful king, about Sir John Falstaff, and about the medieval aristocratic culture of honorific violence. It has much more to do with the positioning of Shakespeare, that cultural cipher, in the long history of British imperial and post-colonial identity and self-consciousness. And in case you haven't realized, I'm sick to death of Tillyard. I'm sick to death of talking about Tillyard, because Tillyard is not a very good critic, and he's like a brain worm that takes a century to get out of your mind. Whenever we mention Tillyard, we get stuck in what Grady identifies as bipolar readings of Shakespeare, where we become either Neo-Tillyardians or anti-Tillyardians. And we ought to be able to just leave it and get back to the text and say something different. And my modest contribution to that is to reassert that Henry is a liar and a hypocrite and a bad king because of it. Well, as for the let's eliminate the simplest possibility. Let's eliminate the fact that Shakespeare would idealize King Henry IV. Throughout Henry IV, Part 1, Shakespeare does nothing, literally almost nothing, to make Henry look good. And I'll give you an example. The historian Holinshed described King Henry IV at the Battle of Shrewsbury between the king and Henry Hotspur. And this is what Holinshed, the great, wonderful Holinshed, this is what he said about the battle. The king, indeed, did that day many a noble feat of arms, for as it is written, he slew that day 36 persons with his enemies. So he killed 36 enemies. Well, Shakespeare completely eliminates this exaggerated claim of heroism. In fact, the king does very poorly at the battle. He is he is criticized by one of his sons for his so-called retirement from the battle. And then he is soundly defeated in combat by the Earl of Douglas, which is no shame, I suppose. And then he has to be rescued by his other son, the one he hates. So, he doesn't, the king does not exactly distinguish himself at the battle, except by having other people win it for him. Now let's get into the meat, the real meat of what happens in the play. Now let's get into the real meat of King Henry's lies. And the main part of the deceit comes from the king versus Hotspur. So before Hotspur decides to rebel, he comes to the king, he apologizes to the king who has criticized him, and he describes some of the battle news that happened recently. Hotspur tells the king that Hotspur's brother-in-law Mortimer was wounded in a fight with Owen Glendower. And Hotspur says, those mouthed wounds which valiantly he took, in single opposition, hand to hand, he did confound the best part of an hour, changing hardiment with great Glendower. So Mortimer fought with Glendower and suffered many bloody wounds. Well, King Henry is not going to accept this description for one moment. He breaks out in a rage. He says, "Oh, no, on the barren mountain let him starve. Thou dost belie him, Percy, thou dost belie him. He never did encounter with Glendower. I tell thee, he durst as well have met the devil alone as Owen Glendower for an enemy. Art thou not ashamed?" So here's the point I'm making. John Wilders says with great neutrality that Henry IV accuses Hotspur of lying and Hotspur accuses the king of lying. But it's even simpler than that. Mortimer either did fight with Glendower or he didn't. This is a matter of fact. The king is either telling the truth about it or is lying about it, willfully. Now, any other possibilities I'll show you why we can dismiss them in a moment. He's either lying or he isn't. So we've actually seen the moment when the king receives the news about this battle. So we can already be very, very suspicious that the king is lying. In order to understand why he's lying and the fact that he is lying, who is Edmund Mortimer? Who is this Mortimer, the Earl of March? Well, actually, he's a character who didn't really exist in history. He was a mistake by Holinshed and Hall. So, but according to Holinshed and Shakespeare, this character Mortimer was actually proclaimed by the murdered King Richard as being the official heir to the crown. And this is a detail that Shakespeare makes sure to include in Henry IV, Part 1, even though he forgot all about it when he wrote Richard II. And in Holinshed's version of the events, this is what Holinshed says about this discussion between Hotspur and the king on the subject of Mortimer, Hotspur's brother-in-law. This is what Holinshed says. The earl taken prisoner, the king was not hasty to purchase the deliverance of the Earl of March, because his title to the crown we well enough known, and therefore suffered him to remain in miserable prison, wishing both the said earl and all other of his lineage out of his life, with God and his saints in heaven, so that they've been out of the way. Now, the Percys respond to this hilarious description. Percys respond to what the king says thusly. The Percys, with this answer and fraudulent excuse, were not a little fumed. Right? I love Holinshed, I've realized. So Holinshed says the king is lying, that he's a fraud in this respect. And this is not just, and Shakespeare does not make any excuses for the king's fraudulence, his obvious dishonesty. This is not just a case of Shakespeare's perspectivism, by which each character tends to see the world in their own terms. This is a king, and this is royal and state policy being conducted through desperate and deliberate deception to get rid of a noble rival, conducted in a state of anger and foolish impatience, something that Shakespeare often criticizes. And all of this leads to a bloody civil war, followed by another one after that. Now, what about the charge of hypocrisy? Yeah, what about the charge of hypocrisy? Well, hypocrisy was a very known concept in the Middle Ages. Chaucer uses it. John Gower writes, false semblant hath in company the dark untrue hypocrisy, whose word discordeth to his thought. And the great Wycliffe says, in a religious sense, hypocrisy is a false feigning of holiness when it is not in truth before God. So we've already seen twice the hypocrisy of Henry Bolingbroke in taking the crown from Richard and murdering him. And from Holinshed, we've seen hypocrisy in the religious sense when the king wishes the entire Mortimer family to be with the saints in heaven. In other words, he wishes them dead. A line which Shakespeare liked so much that he used it in Act 3. But you know, the king is a hypocrite from the very first speech in the play. Sorry, somebody speaking? Okay, I'll just continue. So the king commits hypocrisy with the first speech in the play, when he says that the civil wars are at an end and that he will unify England and we will all now go on a great crusade to Jerusalem. Says the king, those opposed eyes, which like the meteors of a troubled heaven, all of one nature, of one substance spread, did lately meet in the intestine shock of in furious close of civil butchery, shall now, in mutual well-beseeming ranks, march all one way and be no more opposed, against acquaintance, kindred, and allies. Therefore, friends, as far as to the sepulchre of Christ, under whose blessed cross we are impressed and engaged to fight, forth with the power of English shall we levy. So the king says, on no uncertain terms, unambiguously, the king says he shall go on crusade. But 6 lines later, only 6 lines later, he directly contradicts himself, and he says, but this our purpose now is 12-month old, and bootless 'tis to tell you we will go. And immediately after, he confirms, this breaks off our business to the Holy Land. So, if the king knows that he's not really going to Jerusalem, why does he spend 27 passionate lines telling his council that he shall go to Jerusalem? I don't say that Henry doesn't personally want to go on crusade. Shakespeare says that later. I say that he promises to do it as a political expedient, as an excuse, even though he has no intention of doing it for the foreseeable future. But this is minor hypocrisy compared to his promise to put an end to the civil wars and make peace with the barons and unite the country. For after receiving the news of Hotspur's glorious victory against the Scots, a victory that helps the king to survive, protects his throne, a victory that benefits the king, after receiving news of his glorious victory against the Scots, the ungrateful king immediately complains about Hotspur and says, what think you, coz, of this young Percy's pride? The prisoners to his own use he keeps, and sends me word I shall have none. So, over this symbolic issue of whether the Percy family get to keep some of their prisoners of war, this symbolic issue, the king not only directly uses the excuse of Percy's pride to cancel his Jerusalem trip, which is absurd, but he immediately challenges and insults the powerful Percy family. He calls the Earl of Worcester a moody servant, very dangerous, and says to Hotspur, send me your prisoners, or you shall hear of us in such a kind as to displease you. This is a direct and unmistakable threat of violence. And so I ask you, does this sound like the actions of a man who is committed to peace, to unity, and to ending the civil wars between the aristocrats? On the contrary, the king picks an unnecessary fight with the most powerful landowning family in Britain, the Percys, the same family that made Henry the king, as Hotspur keeps continually pointing out. A wise king would have been sure to stay friends with the Percy family, or at least appear to be friends with them, to keep them on the council, to seek their advice. Instead, even when Hotspur humbles himself and declares his love for the king, again, the king refuses to accept Hotspur's apology and instead begins another angry rant about Mortimer. So, as Shakespeare dramatizes it, this confrontation with Hotspur is the exact moment, the direct reason that convinces Hotspur to join his uncle in rebellion. There might have been a rebellion, but not necessarily with Hotspur. Now, of course, I want to connect my statement that Henry is a liar to a somewhat larger critical paradigm that works across the history plays. And that brings me to the case of Jan Kott, the Polish scholar who is the anti-Tillyard of Shakespeare's history critics. Kott saw the seeds of Beckett and the theater of the absurd in Shakespeare. And Kott is a strange case because he achieved great prominence as a critic in the 1960s, kind of prominence that most academics will never reach, only dream about. He even had a powerful influence on very famous stage productions of the plays, such as those by Peter Brook and Peter Hall, among others. And then suddenly, he disappeared from the critical and scholarly conversation by the 1980s. He just disappeared. His work is never reproduced or republished in critical volumes. You would think that he'd committed a sin. Presumably, he was forgotten because his point of view was not convenient for the so-called cultural materialist school of the late 80s, which on the whole rejected the potential of genuinely skeptical and subversive energies in Shakespeare's plays. And that's exactly what we see in Greenblatt's famous interpretation of the plays, which sent American new historicism at its best, and yet is clearly beset by self-imposed limitations. Anyway, this is Kott's view of the history plays, and I really like this quote. Feudal history is like a great staircase on which there treads a constant procession of kings. Every step upwards is marked by murder, perfidy, treachery. Every step on the staircase brings the throne closer. Another step and the crown will fall. One will soon be able to snatch it. But from the highest step, there is only a leap into the abyss. In other words, Shakespeare's history of the monarchy is all sad stories of the death of kings, all of them murdered. For Kott, the history plays are more or less tragic comedies or mixed comedy and tragedy. The royal narrative is tragic rather than providential. It's a tragic view of English kingship. While the mixed representation of the plays, that is to say, the representation of Falstaff and the lower classes, is satirical comical. As we see from Falstaff's memorable line, "Well, God be thanked for these rebels. They offend none but the virtuous. I laud them. I praise them." Or from such lower class characters as the great Jack Cade in Henry VI, who says, "All right, let's kill all the lawyers," right? Okay, now, what is the major counter argument to my criticism of King Henry as a bad king by virtue of his hypocrisy and deceit? Well, the major counter argument, and a serious one to what I'm saying, is that does the king's hypocrisy really matter? Should kings be morally flexible? Is honesty really a virtue for a ruler? And quite a few centuries of people saying no. Henry's deceit, I mean, the simplest answer to this is that Henry's deceit simply doesn't meet the test of efficacy. It doesn't bring about rationally desirable ends for him. His lack of honesty and candor in dealing with the Percys leads directly, almost directly, to Hotspur's rebellion. Not only that, but his previous hypocrisies provide the Percys with exactly the excuse they need to rebel and to get rid of the king, if they can. Because when Henry Bolingbroke first captures King Richard II, he swears to the king in the presence of the Percys, he swears, "My gracious lord, I come but for mine own." In other words, he swears he has no intention of taking the crown before he actually takes it and then murders the king. So in part 1 of Henry IV, this false oath is mentioned no less than 5 times as the justification for Hotspur's rebellion. By the way, I'm not concerned with the morality of the rebels. That's another issue. They're not the king. So does I admit, though, that although that is a good answer, that the question is a little bit more complicated than that on 2 points. First, there's the case of honest Hotspur. Hotspur is an honest man. Does that mean he's a good leader? Number 2, a larger issue, the common critical notion that Shakespeare himself is a Machiavellian with no principled commitment to honesty in politics. Well, let's take the Hotspur argument. It's an overrated argument, although one that I take seriously, but it's an overrated argument. And the argument is basically that Hotspur, his impatience with ordinary politics, with ordinary political compromises, his impatience with basically the ethical and discursive give and take with politics, that his impatience with this is the cause of his downfall. And Hotspur is an honest man. He's the only honest, straightforward, inflexible representative of the aristocratic culture of martial honor. But does his impatience lead to his downfall and his ineffectiveness to defeat the king? Well, although there is a point to be made about Hotspur's inflexibility, this argument is very overrated because Shakespeare himself insists on the possibility that Hotspur loses the Battle of Shrewsbury not because of his impatience, but because he listens to his devious and anxious uncle, who convinces him not to make a surprise attack on the king's army by night. In other words, Hotspur wants to attack, his uncle prevents him, and they lose. Now, what about this great issue of Shakespeare, Machiavelli, and truth in politics? Well, let us turn to Henry V, to the loyal Welsh captain Llewellyn in Henry V, who says to the young king the following lines. And by the way, these lines that he says have no trace whatsoever of belief in the divine right of kings. So forget about Tillyard. Captain Llewellyn says this: "You need not be ashamed of your majesty, praised be God, so long as your majesty is an honest man." So the question is there, in Shakespeare's art of point and counterpoint, argument and counter-argument, is there any serious Machiavellian counterpoint in Shakespeare's history plays that would cause us to seriously question Llewellyn's belief that a king should be an honest man? Now, Prince Hal himself is, shall we say, morally flexible without actually lying. But I don't think that any readers, even the Neo-Tillyardians, question that Shakespeare meant for the son, the despised son, Hal. I think anybody will agree that Shakespeare meant the son to be more honest than his father. So, but anyway, to go back to the question, is there a counterpoint to what Llewellyn says? Well, funny enough, one of the most effective arguments about Captain Llewellyn comes from Jan Kott's radical relativist defense of Shakespeare's bad kings. Because Kott says this, and I don't agree with this as much as his previous statement. Kott says, "For there are no bad kings or good kings. Kings are only kings. Or let us put it in modern terms. There is only the king's situation and the system. This situation leaves no room for freedom of choice. In Shakespeare's world, there is a contradiction between the order of action and the moral order. This contradiction is human fate." So this is a very serious argument, but the thrust of his argument about the grand mechanism of power, of course it's important, but I think it goes rather too far in terms of moral relativism and in terms of absolving a ruler from the responsibility of good government. I don't think that Shakespeare's view of royal and governmental ethics is so cynical that individual choices just don't matter for the subjects, don't matter for kings or for the subjects of the kings who have to live with his decisions. And so many of the king's subjects, especially lower class characters, make that point. I think in Shakespeare's world, there is a difference between Richard II and Richard III. There's even a difference between Richard III and Henry V, who invades France and slaughters thousands. So I don't think that Jan Kott's conclusion is textual. a bad, and philosophically speaking, which is we don't have time for really, but does a bad system absolve a ruler of responsibility for better governance? I don't think so. Well, let's take this argument from the opposite way. Instead of looking at whether Fluellen is right or not, let's take the exact opposite, the most extreme nihilist-materialist view of truth in Shakespeare's world. Now, this view was advanced, not many know, by Deleuze and Nietzsche, or rather Deleuze interpreting Nietzsche, because Deleuze was a huge fan of the great theater actor manager Orson Welles's Shakespeare films, and presumably also his Shakespeare stagings. And Deleuze interpreted the Welles's Shakespeare productions according to a kind of Nietzschean, but also neo-Falstaffian modernist view of non-morality. So what Deleuze says about truth and morality is this: it doesn't exist. Deleuze says the true world does not exist, and if it did, if it could be described, it would be useless, superfluous. And furthermore, says Deleuze, any piece of literature that truly as you see, there's a problem here. Any piece of literature that describes this situation of the universe, that describes the universe in this way as it is for humans, any piece of literature that describes it this way, there is no longer a structure of judgment in those kinds of literature. There is no longer a moral and ideological standpoint for judging the characters. There are no representations, only descriptions. Right? In an honest literary description of a truthless universe. Bradshaw might agree with this in saying that in Shakespeare there are no espoused views, only point and counterpoint from multiple perspectives. But Deleuze, following Nietzsche, goes further. Deleuze says people themselves are not people. That is, they're not persons, but personae. People are merely actors or fakers. People are virtual theatrical role players, an idea which is quite relevant to the emphasis of post-Greenblatt criticism on the role playing and in Elizabethan intellectual culture, the sort of taking on and off of identities. But Deleuze calls such people forgers, falsifiers, people who are always faking something either to themselves, which is important, or to others in order to survive, to get by. And he further says that the common link between forgers is the natural necessity of betrayal, including, therefore, the betrayal of Falstaff by Prince Hal. So on this view of Shakespeare, which to me is certainly truer than Tillyard's, Hugh Grady says this: these motifs suggest a post-medieval Machiavellian Montaigne world in which everything is potentially counterfeit, and in which what is true and what is false will shift as we move from one social and political context to another, inasmuch as it asserts the efficacy of appearances over substance in the human world. Or as David Scott Caston says of Henry IV, the king himself, the kingship itself is a disguise, a role, an action that a man might play. Even Henry can bear himself only like the king. He has no authentic identity prior to and untouched by representation. Or I think Deleuze would use the word description, not representation. But that's what he says about King Henry IV and his situation. Well, what are the consequences for truth and morality of this truthless universe? Well, let's say, what are the consequences for morality of this truthless universe? In this view of the ethical horizon, a truthful man who is not a forger or who tries not to be a forger is a deluded man, a judgmental man, an intolerant man, a constructionist. And such a man is destined to be a disaster to all those around him, just as Hotspur is, let's face it, a disaster to his family, and especially a disaster to his wife. So in this Nietzschean Shakespeare, without a moral anchor, either human or divine, through which the distinction between truth and lying might matter, human existence in and out of society consists, says Deleuze, of bodies which are forces, nothing but forces. So no truth, no morality, even ideas are basically smoke screens, ideologies are smoke screens. All that is really there for human life is bodies and forces. Bodies which are forces, forces, nothing but forces. But my point is this, even on this view, where the world is without a moral center, even on this view, Deleuze opposes exhausted and spent forces, which desperately appeal to the will to dominate, to changeable, variable forces, which are constantly reinventing themselves, thus representing the goodness of life itself. And what Deleuze is referring to is Falstaff, right? There are exhausted and spent forces, forces that are falling apart. And those are the forces that cling to the will to dominate. And then there are changeable, variable forces, which are constantly reinventing themselves. Falstaff is an organic, revitalizing force. He even rises from the dead in Act 5, right, of the play. Whereas King Henry IV, by contrast, well, you know, by the way, Falstaff rising from the dead is, of course, like James Joyce's Finnegan. But King Henry IV, by contrast, is a spent force, literally exhausting himself to death before our eyes, dying of the exhaustions of his office as he carries it out. So my point is, whether you take Fluellen's view of moral responsibility, which is the view that I'm not a king, so I may have to serve somebody in this life. I will have to serve somebody, but if you expect me to do anything but the bare minimum, if you expect me to be motivated to make you successful, then you'd better deal open-handedly with me, right? So whether you take Fluellen's view, as I would like to, or whether you take this Nietzschean non-moral view, which puts no real responsibility on rulers, one could say that the type of deceit characteristic of Henry is the opposite of effective deceit, because it's not flexible, it's not capable of reinvention, it's not inventive. It's merely a predictably futile struggle of denial of death, denial of decline, denial of the dispersal of authority. In fact, his kind of deceit only contributes to his decline through endless civil wars with feudal barons that Henry seems to have no idea how to deal with. A clever forger, like Prince Hal, for example, would say anything that the Percys wanted to hear up to the point of giving royal authority away to them. But Henry doesn't even try. Instead, he pushes them out of his circle, makes empty threats against the most powerful allies he's got from a precarious position. Now, I'm almost done. I want to make two more quick points, but very fascinating points. First is the issue of prediction. Now, this is kind of a sideways glance from the topic of dishonesty. I hope you'll see that there is a connection, but it is a sideways connection. I'm most interested in this topic. Shakespeare's protagonists are obsessed with knowledge, but they're not obsessed with knowledge of the past. Not even Henry, really. They're not obsessed with knowledge of the past. They're obsessed with knowledge of the future in the sense of making true predictions. So what I'm talking about, what I'm interested in is knowledge of the knowledge of the future in the sense of prediction of the future based on one's understanding of the present. Shakespearean protagonist seeks true prediction to know what happens in his future so he can benefit himself. Of course, the great example is Macbeth. Macbeth is gifted with true knowledge of the future from the witches, a transcendental source. Harold Bloom calls this prolepsis. And Macbeth has great insight in this way, too. But yes, so he's given this knowledge from a transcendental source. And it's true, because every action Macbeth takes brings about the future exactly as it was told to him. Except that Macbeth does not benefit from this future. He doesn't benefit from this knowledge of the future because he didn't appreciate the context, perhaps. And so he doesn't benefit. In fact, it kills him, right? So what is most interesting to me about Shakespeare's heroes, anti-heroes, like Macbeth, Brutus, Antony, Hamlet, is they face the irony that ensues when prediction and conjecture about the future turns out to be quite correct, and yet still fails to be of use or benefit to the one who is in possession of that true knowledge. Is true knowledge an oxymoron? I'm not sure. Probably. So it doesn't benefit them. They have strong beliefs that turn out to be absolutely correct, but it doesn't benefit them in any way. And that's fascinating. Falstaff. Let's take the case of Falstaff. Falstaff is the first and only one in the play to mention the idea of banishment, thus not only correctly predicting that Henry V will banish him, but quite possibly pushing the prince into accepting the idea of banishing Falstaff. So in a sense, Falstaff brings about his own banishment innocently. Hotspur's uncle Wister is the same thing. He brings about his own destruction by failed rebellion because he makes the extremely sound and convincing conjecture that King Henry will find an excuse to destroy him if he doesn't rebel. And, you know, it's a very good theory, and I have no doubt about it. But so he rebels, and he brings about his own destruction, self-fulfilling doom. But the most fascinating case is Henry himself. By predicting the rebellious intent of Mortimer and the Percys, which turns out to be true, Henry preemptively causes that very rebellion by his poor treatment of them rather than avoiding it. It was avoidable. He knew what was coming. He causes it rather than avoiding it. And that, to me, is fascinating. It's an unexplored theme in Shakespeare. All right, I have just one more thing to say, and then a quick conclusion. Shakespeare gave us a commentary on Henry IV. And of course, I mean this as a modern reader constructing modern Shakespeare as I can understand him. Shakespeare gave a commentary on Henry IV, and this commentary was Sonnet 94. They that have the power to hurt and will do none, that do not do the thing they most do show, who moving others are themselves as stone, unmoved, cold, and to temptation slow, they rightly do inherit heaven's graces. But if that flower with base infection meet, the basest weed outbraves his dignity, for sweetest things turn sourest by their deeds. Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. So the point is this: the weed is Falstaff. The king, who should be the lily, the royal flower, right? The king smells worse than Falstaff because, unlike Falstaff, the king is a bearer of real and consequential power, who is quick to temptation, unable to forbear, quick and wild in his anger, and corrupted by the easiness with which a king can lie and get away with it. All right, now I'm coming to my conclusion. Shakespeare was, I won't say caught because Shakespeare was interested in this binary, or if you will, dialectic, what Lovejoy describes as a conflict between two irreconcilable and originally metaphysical conceptions of the good. Something which we could call organic vitalism, which is represented in a sort of secular form by Falstaff. Organic vitalism versus monism as the beatification of order. Look, order is not a dirty word. All things being equal, like Thomas More, Shakespeare could imagine other political systems, for example, in The Tempest. But he does not seem to have really given much thought to other political systems, such as classical republicanism. He more or less tried to live in the world he knew, the world of the monarchy, and looked at it from within. But I disagree with the nihilist relativist meaning to the extent that all things being equal in the English monarchical system, Shakespeare prefers, as a matter of course, political order over political disorder, since disorder, which means preventable wars, unravels all social bonds, as in the father who kills his own son in battle in Henry VI. Now, this perfectly reasonable preference has gotten Shakespeare into more trouble in the last 40 years than anything else, allowing his extremist critics to imagine him as a kind of Machiavellian would-be court advisor to the brutal regime of the dreadful Walsingham, the Queen's enforcer. Now, let me make clear, Shakespeare preferring all things being equal, order to disorder, this does not mean that tyrants like Richard III, say, are less of a problem than rebels. As Kott says, one thing begets the other. Henry IV is a rebel, and he's an absolutist ruler, and a liar, and a hypocrite. But Shakespeare's governmental order also means that kings should tell no unnecessary lies. Now, none of this measured caution represents a defense of the monarchical system from the outside. Shakespeare's Henry V, unlike his father, is represented as brilliant, vital, creative, perhaps as the best possible English king in an imperfect world. I don't think there's any reason to doubt that Shakespeare's Henry V represents the best English king that he can or does represent in an imperfect world, in a bad system, at the very least, a extremely flawed system. Henry V is the best possible of kings in this history. But if Prince Hal, Henry V, who plans months in advance to betray his best friends, who executes his prisoners of war, who invades France and slaughters thousands, merely as an exercise in acquiring military honors to his name and making his father's guilt seem less bad. If Prince Hal, who leaves the British Empire in a state of collapse after his death, if Henry V is the best possible English king, then, to return to Kott, this is not a working system. Or as Alan Bennett said memorably, the state of monarchy and the state of lunacy share a frontier. Now, I have concluded, but I did want to mention one other issue because it's fascinating to me. This issue of lunacy, monarchs being crazy, which is more relevant, more common in Shakespeare than you might think. And it's my favorite line from Henry IV, Part 1, where the situation is Prince Hal has promised that he will banish Falstaff. And then the police are at the door. The police have come to arrest Falstaff. Falstaff is guilty as hell. The prince doesn't have to do anything. He can let Falstaff be arrested. Falstaff bravely confronts the king, says either save me or don't, doesn't matter. And he says this to the king: "Dost thou hear, Hal? Never call a true piece of gold a counterfeit. Thou art essentially made without seeming so." So Falstaff says, "Thou art essentially made without seeming so." The only problem is this line makes no sense. For 400 years, every edition of Shakespeare has tried to explain this line, and nobody can adequately explain it. Nobody can understand it. Nobody can explain what Shakespeare intended to say. It just doesn't make any sense. Now, people have come up with various explanations. Hugh Grady has a pretty nice explanation, but his explanation, which is nice, is not more linguistically compelling than anybody else's. So my point is this: in the third folio, which is from 1663, in the third folio, somebody changed the line, and Falstaff says to Hal, "Thou art essentially mad without seeming so." In other words, Falstaff says to Hal, "You don't think you're crazy. Nobody else thinks you're crazy, but you're crazy." Now, this gets back to creative reading, which I started with. Creative reading in your own context. And I also warned about falsifying the text. But here's the thing. In the modern day, we trust scholars to have done their homework and to give us honest, well-researched texts. But in 1663, the situation was different. In 1663, some scribe or printer decided that this line made no sense and that it must be a mistake. So they took off the E, probably assumed that the E was a printer's error, unless they made the error themselves, but they probably assumed that it was a printer error, and they took it off. And suddenly the line makes perfect sense, and it is my favorite line in the play. And, you know, that scribe made a good, I think he made a good creative decision, because the quartos were full of errors, and the line didn't make any sense. So thou art essentially mad without seeming so. I wanted to make that point before I leave. Okay, well, that's all. I may have gone a little bit over time. I'm sorry about that. In fact, I really have. So I didn't quite realize how over time I'd went. I'm sorry. Well, we still have a few minutes for questions, if anybody wants to ask them. Try to unshare my screen. So does anyone have any questions? Does anybody feel confused on a key point or would like me to clarify something?
Well, Peter, I noticed that you mentioned the forces between the king and Fosters, and I am confused with forces. What does it mean? Thank you.
Are you talking about Deleuze and Deleuze's Nietzschean interpretation of the plays and Falstaff?
Yes, the forces.
Yeah, what he's saying is basically this is a nihilist-materialist view of reality in which nothing essentially exists but physics. And the only human reality worth paying attention to, the only thing that's not a sort of a convenient lie for the benefit of one person over the other, very Lacanian really, and Foucauldian. The only thing that's true is physics, is human bodies and forces. Forces, physical forces act on human bodies, and human bodies themselves are forces that act on the rest of the world. So that's nature. Nature is this brutal place without any, brutal but also joyous in a way for Nietzsche. It's this brutal place without any ideals. So the point I was making is that even if you hold that most extreme of not only morally nihilist, but strictly materialist, reductionist view of reality, as Beckett seems to do in his plays, for example. That may be simplifying Beckett a little bit, but that's where Deleuze got a lot of his ideas. Even if you hold that view, Henry is a terrible king. You know, and his tactics, his behavior just doesn't work. And so he's contrasted to Falstaff, who can reinvent himself. He rises from the dead, whereas Henry does nothing but go to his grave throughout the whole play. Now, I'll add something to this. One of the I really love Jan Kott's quote, and I hope that your students take it to heart, those who study literature, that royal history for Shakespeare is like a staircase, and at each step you have to do terrible things until you get to the crown, and then you get to the top step, you grab the crown, and then you fall. The only problem is that Henry actually dies in his sleep. Henry IV, this not very good king, dies in his sleep, as does Prince Hal, Henry V. But you know, that was a fact. Shakespeare couldn't change it. And I think Henry dies with his fears about the future not really assuaged. He dies fearing the future, fearing his own son. Right? One of the tragic things about King Henry, it's sort of a tragedy with no tragedy, King Henry IV. One of the tragic things about Henry is that he doesn't understand his son, and he never will up to the point of his death. And he sort of reconciles with his son in the last 90 seconds of his life, but he never really understands it. And that is a domestic tragedy. Thank you for that question. I think a lot of people have left, which is fine. Fine. Does anyone have any more questions? I wonder, I know that my drama students have come, many of you. I wonder if anybody else came from our school. I hope so. Any other questions? Someone says thank you. That's very nice. Any other questions?
Hello, Peter.
Yes, hello.
I want to ask a question about Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, there's a lot of rumors that said Shakespeare was actually a mean businessman.
Yeah.
And after hearing the rumor, every time I read his works, his dramas, and his not that unpleasant image of an evil and mean businessman would appear in my mind. And,
well, certainly not evil, but mean. Yeah, a mean businessman. What little, we just don't have enough evidence. I mean, you never know. Shakespeare might have been magnificently generous to his best friends. We don't know. He seems to have been pretty good friends with other playwrights, his rivals like Ben Jonson. You could almost say they loved each other, from Jonson's side of it. But yeah, he was a mean businessman. And but of course, one of the points I was making is that the text comes first, not Shakespeare's biography. And most of those biographical legends are not actually relevant to Shakespeare's text. I mean, in other words, you have to stretch so far to try to make them relevant, and you might commit anachronism, or you might just be committing the biographical fallacy, or it's not relevant. Did he understand the necessity of force on occasion? It seems so, but mainly from his text. The biographical thing is sort of part of our sort of creative historical imagination that we can apply to text. And we can do it as long as it helps our readings and doesn't falsify the text in any way, and doesn't commit anachronism of the kind that's illogical, right? That's one of the points I was making in the early part of the lecture about textual interpretation. All right, well, I think that these were good questions, and I think that we have to go now. I hope that some people from in and out school attended the Shakespeare Festival, apart from our drama students, which is great. I don't know if I'm the last lecturer. I think there may be one more after this. If I am the last lecturer, I hope that we had a successful makeshift online Shakespeare Festival. At some point, we will have a production probably of Twelfth Night. And I hope you enjoyed it. And I am finished.